This is an ABC podcast. You're listening to The Country Hour on ABC Radio South Australia and Broken Hill.
Hello, welcome to The Country Hour this spring afternoon. I'm Cassie Huff, and it's almost hay cutting season, but there doesn't seem to be much optimism around for the crop at the moment, especially now a combination of shipping disruptions and the loss of the Chinese market is causing some headaches for the export market. I'll have more on what's going on soon. And the Royal Adelaide Show might not have been able to go ahead. It would have been on right now if it had been able to. But fortunately, the weather competition did. And while they might be small, the mighty Carcultobee Area School has done it again, winning the most professional school team. And I'll tell you more on how they did it soon.
The kids spent a lot of time talking to our industry experts on the way through during the course, and I think they're really proud of the school and they're proud of the history of the program at the school as well, and I think that sort of all goes into, for them to feel professional and to act accordingly.
But to grain first, and interestingly, countries that don't grow much barley are actually signing up to watch Australia's case against China in the World Trade Organisation. Australia has taken to China to the WTO over its decision to place tariffs of 80% on Australian barley last year. Jeffrey Wilson, a research director at Perth US Asia Institute, is following the case closely, and he says a number of countries are very interested.
Yes, so the WTO case has now been formally impanelled, which effectively means they've appointed the three judges who are going to sit on the case. And as part of that, you also nominate who is going to be a third party, so other countries that are going to be sitting in the courtroom at the same time. This is a bit different from what we might be used to in one of our courts where there's a prosecution and defence, because in Geneva, the third parties are also participants. They get to respond to evidence, make arguments and raise questions. So these other 13 countries are actually active participants, not just passive observers.
So even though the dispute is between Australia and barley and Australia and China, I should say, and they'll mount the bulk of the arguments in the case, these other countries can put their point of view on specific things as the case progresses.
Yes, they can make statements asking questions in support of or dissenting from things that are put forward by both Australia and China. So it's a bit different from what you'd be used to in a kind of adversarial Australian courtroom.
What is interesting about the 13 countries that has signed up to watch this case?
It's very interesting because it's all of the major world economies and many countries that are Australia's friends. Now, it's not uncommon for countries to join these WTO cases as third party, but it would usually be where you have an interest. So if you're a barley exporter, you might be a third party because you've got a stake in what the rules for barley are going to be after the case. But we've seen a whole heap of countries join up, like Japan, the EU, the United States, New Zealand, that don't have an iron in the fire around a particular commodity. The reason these countries are joining up is they care about the principle at stake, which is this issue of whether countries can use dubious anti-dumping rules to try and lock out other countries' products. So we've really got a large group of interested third parties who are wanting to see this as a test case for whether China can do this kind of trade coercion thing in other industries in the future too.
So it's so these countries are watching, even though they don't produce barley, because it might make a legal case or a precedent on something where they might be affected with trade with China.
Absolutely. Japan's not there because it's interested in barley. Japan's interested in using these kind of coercive or trade punishment things through these anti-dumping duties.
Has Australia asked its friends to be involved in this case, or are they doing this of their own volition?
There's certainly been a lot of diplomacy around China's trade bashing of Australia over the last 18 months. Australian government's made representations to lots of friendly and like-minded countries around the world, and we've had supportive statements issued by the Japanese government, the American government, even on occasions EU trade officials as well. So we've certainly seen a lot of backroom diplomacy designed to kind of get a coalition together to take up this case. This means that it's bigger than just our barley any longer or any of our other cereals. It's actually going to become an international test case for, are countries allowed to do this kind of thing? It could be in other commodities, it could be to other countries, or not even farm sectors in the future. So it's really become a global precedent-setting case over, can you use trade to bully other countries?
Do you know if that's a good thing for Australian barley producers who are angry about these tariffs in the first place, that they're now suddenly this international test case?
It will make the process more complicated because it's going to be a pretty packed courtroom. But the reality is this is a big deal, and it also supports Australia's position. These cases are very complicated. If any of your growers listening in have gone and had a look at the official case files, there's over 20 different points of law that are being adjudicated over this process. And having a lot of other countries with different experiences, their own people, their own industries, their own trade lawyers, really means that you've got a lot more support in that case. Whereas 18 months ago, last May, it was a couple of Australian growers and a few officials from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. There's now a lot more people, a lot more sets of eyes and a lot more arguments on this. So it's effectively a form of, in-kind support coming from a much larger group of people. The industry is not on its own having to have this fight any longer.
Yeah, it's not the first time that dumping tariffs have been taken to the World Trade Organisation, but Australia's case is certainly generating some interest, as Jeffrey Wilson, Research Director of Perth US Asia Institute, speaking with Warwick Long there about that. And I'll stay somewhat in the grains space, but a little bit different because export hay producers are being told to expect poor prices and difficulties in selling this season because of a combination of shipping disruptions and the loss of the Chinese market. In February, 25 of Australia's 28 exporting facilities lost access to China, which was the second largest buyer of Australian ocean hay. Andrew Bolt, who is the Managing Director of Exporter Hay Australia, wrote to suppliers last week to set expectations around price and demand. He says that shipping container shortages have become significantly worse in just the past week, and it's having flow-on effects to the industry.
Logistics and shipping containers have been difficult for the last 18 months. Ever since COVID struck, the shipping situation has got more and more difficult, but it's been workable. We've been able to get equipment and space, and things have been difficult but manageable. Probably only in the last week or so, things have really taken a leg down in terms of the availability of equipment, so being containers and shipping space to send to markets. And it's affecting not just us, but other hay exporters, and container space is getting a lot more difficult to get. And we're starting to see an increased frequency of shipping lines omitting ports. So that's just purely, you're not getting the containers leaving Australia going to market.
So is that just the shipping lines, I suppose, cherry-picking the most lucrative routes?
Oh, look, I think shipping lines are very much looking at their return per container, and they're prioritising where they're maximising their dollar. And unfortunately, it's not in Australia, in the Australian market, and it's not dealing with relatively low value commodities going from Australia to markets in Asia.
That's one issue. The other I mentioned earlier, access into China. People may recall back in early this year that your facilities and I think 25 of the 28 hay exporting facilities around the country lost that access into China. Do you and do the other 25, the other of the 25 remain barred?
Look, we're not barred. The issue is every plant that sends product to China is registered for the market, and as of February, those registrations came up for renewal. None of those registrations were renewed, so they just lapsed, and so by default, you'd no longer have access to that market. Look, we've got no visibility, no understanding of any change to that situation. There certainly hasn't been any advice provided since that time.
Andrew, this season, Hay Australia didn't offer any contracts to growers at sowing time. So I guess it was up to them to decide whether they wanted to sow oat hay or not and hopefully find a buyer. Was that a consequence of the lack of the Chinese market?
Look, I mean, that was a very big component of it. There's just been a massive change in the supply-demand equation, and with such a major market being withdrawn, the supply situation was well in excess of what the demand from the remaining markets are. And so that's just been a huge challenge, for us and for the whole industry to deal with. There's so much going on at the moment, so many areas of uncertainty that, we can't, as a business, provide much more advice about, what we think demand and pricing is going to look like at this point in time.
So, given that, Andrew, maybe you can't answer this question, but wrapping up all of these issues, what do they mean for growers? They've got oat and hay crops, potentially oat and hay crops that look really good. Will Hay Australia be buying those crops, and what will it be paying for them?
Yeah, look, I certainly can't answer the payment question, Angus, but look, we're certainly trying to work with our growers and provide a marketing option for them going forward. We certainly see it's going to be a slower pace of delivery, in this coming year, because by virtue of the Chinese market not being there, the demand from the rest of the market is significantly less. High quality hay, the top grades of hay are still going to be strongly demanded, we believe, but certainly perhaps some of the, lower quality grades of hay, high yielding crops, perhaps there is going to be significantly softer demand for those types of and styles of hay.
A measured outlook there from Andrew Bolt, Managing Director of Processing and Exporting Business Hay Australia, speaking with Angus Verley. It's 16 minutes past 12 on the Country Hour. And to dairy now, where there's been a jump in the Global Dairy Trade Index this week, but analysts say these strong prices may not last until the end of the year. The GDT rose 4% and skim milk powder went up by more than 7%, quite a big rise there. And senior dairy analyst for Rabobank, Michael Harvey, told Megan Hughes China's domestic production is continuing to rise, and that is going to impact on import demand.
Now, that had followed a couple of auctions where we've seen weakness in the pricing complex, so that was certainly positive news. And it wasn't completely unsurprising. I mean, if you looked at some of the supply and demand fundamentals for dairy in the last couple of weeks, you'd certainly seen some volume come off the auction platform, so there was less product for sale in the way they measure that. But there's also some indicators where, the market's still in pretty good balance because some of the supply growth of export regions has started to slow a little bit, and you've still got, pretty healthy purchasing coming from some of the major Asian buyers. So you bundle all that together and you get a little bit of a bounce in the auction result. And yeah, there's mixed results across the board. But when you're always looking at the GDT auction through the Australian lens, there's always a keen eye on the performance of skim milk powder and cheese, because they are a bigger part of what our product mix is. So we do keep an eye on everything else and whole milk powder in general. But yeah, when you get a bounce in skim milk powder and cheddar, that's a good lead indicator for export returns for Australian dairy companies.
Now, as I understand, in terms of the dairy export market, things are doing pretty well across the board at the moment. But it looks like the demand at the moment from China is going to start easing in the latter part of the year.
Well, that's the critical watch. I mean, there's probably two things you're looking at the moment. I mean, you've got the New Zealand spring curve just around the corner, so the strength of that curve will always have an impact on price direction in the coming months. But you've also got that story around, China import demand. For the last 12 months at least, China have done a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of trade of dairy products, so they've provided a lot of demand support, and you've had supply growth out of the export regions growing, but fairly modestly. So that's kept the market in balance. Now we've just we take a look further over the horizon. So we've just published our 12-month outlook piece, and we do caution a little bit around expectations for pricing to bounce back and to remain at these levels. And we're basically expecting a little bit more softness to come in the coming 12 months, really on the back of an expectation that we do think China's import demand, which has been really strong and certainly outperformed our expectations to date, will start to slow a little bit, and that'll likely ripple through in terms of some price correction.
And it seems like there's a bit of a saturation in the US market as well. Will that have much of a flow-on effect?
Well, that's part of the supply story. So when you look around the world at all the major producers of milk that sell into export markets, and Australia is part of that story, you've got very, very high milk pricing, and that's good for farmers. But there is some margin pressure in some economies, because of feed costs, rising and things like that. So that's the balance between looking at the supply outlook and recognising that a lot of farmers are enjoying really good milk pricing, and certainly here in Australia, you couple that with good seasonal conditions and fairly affordable feed, and you've got a good profitability across the sector. But there's pressure in the Northern Hemisphere and in certainly some of the South American countries where the cost of feed is starting to squeeze margins, and that does lead to a bit of a slowdown in supply growth. So that's price supportive for commodities, because if you get less supply growth out of the export regions, it does go a long way to keeping the market in balance. And
It was Senior Dairy Analyst for Rabobank, Michael Harvey, speaking with Megan Hughes. Now, we'll get to weather shortly, but first, the title of the most professional school team at the Merino Weather Competition is staying on the Eyre Peninsula once again. The region really has been the heavy hitter when it comes to this competition. The 11th Schools Weather Comp was held yesterday at the Royal Adelaide Showgrounds, where there were 210 weathers and students who competed. Meningie Area School won the overall meet and fleece value for 2021, and the EP's Carcoltaby Area School won the most professional school team. And the ag teacher there, Tim Coleman, says it was a real team effort.
They're a great bunch of kids, and they've just done an awesome job. They're very professional. The older students in the team have mentored the younger students and actually other classes as well. And so it's just been a fantastic team effort, actually.
When you first heard that the show had been cancelled again, what went through your mind?
Oh, it was very traumatic for us as the kids. I mean, because we're about 8 hours from Adelaide, and so we were concerned about the trip across and whether we'd be able to get there and whether it would go ahead. And so we've kind of been stuck between it'll go ahead and then it won't, and it has been really difficult for us.
What sort of prep has gone into getting there to the competition?
Yeah, so the kids started in February, and with industry experts like our other breeders and farmers, and to select a larger team of about 16 sheep, and then we bring them on site. They're shorn, and we start feeding them, and the kids start working with them, handling them, and then they start to select which ones are going to go for our two teams. So there's a lot of work that goes in it. They're just constantly handling the sheep. The kids are learning about confirmation and wool, as well as government paperwork for PIRSA, for the animals being moved on site and all that kind of stuff as well.
It must have been, I guess, a relief when you finally got there and were able to show these sheep.
Yeah, it was. I think it was a relief for all the ag teachers to finally get our teams on site. It's a very different atmosphere at the show when the steers and everything else isn't running. You
must be pretty proud of the team for taking. Is it the most professional school team? Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, very proud of the students that we've taken. There's we also, one of the students was second in the Handler Award as well. And all of the kids were a really great handler, so the award could have gone to any of the kids. They're professional about the way they keep the pens clean. They're professional about the way they present themselves. They're wearing the uniform, staying neat and tidy. And we also go through talking to judges and when the show's open to the public, talking to the public and making sure that we represent our sheep and our school and ourselves really well.
Carcoltaby Area School has won this award quite a few times now. What is it about the school that you think impresses the judges?
We're a small school, and the kids spend a lot of time talking to our industry experts on the way through during the course. So, we try and get them in front of farmers and stud breeders, and I think they're really proud of the school, and they're proud of the history of the program at the school as well. And I think that sort of all goes into, for them to feel professional and to act accordingly. And
this award has stayed on the Eyre Peninsula for quite a few years as well. That must be promising for sheep producers around the EP.
Yeah, we're really chuffed about that. It's gone to us, Woodner and Cummins, since the start of this part of the competition. So I think breeders are really happy, and our long-term goal, I guess, is to have students go back into the industry, which I think that seems to be the case. race.
That was Carculteby Area School Ag teacher Tim Coleman. Now we're joined by Ag student Toby Baker. G'day, Toby.
G'day.
How did you go at the competition? Must be pretty happy.
Yeah, we were all pretty stoked with how we went, taking on the professional team for the fourth time this time. We won it 3 years in a row, a couple of years back, and the award stayed on the EP since.
What do you think it is about your school that the judges really like what you do?
I don't know, I guess we just take lots of care with everything we do, practice a lot at the school, get tips from all our industry experts, all our stud breeders around us, all the teachers, everyone that helps, all the young students that come and help us get prepared for the show by helping clean and that kind of stuff. It all contributes somehow.
What do you love about taking part in the competition like the school Merino Weather Comp?
It's just really interesting, and you get to hold these animals that, you know, you've presented and looked after for a fair few months now, and just to see all the hard work pay off with a few awards is just pretty good.
Carculteby Area School Year 10 student Toby Baker speaking with Brooke Neindorf. They're very chuffed with the win, and you can see all the results from that school comp online at merinosa.com.au. We'll head across to the Weather Bureau now, where I'm joined by senior forecaster Tom Bowen. Good afternoon.
Hello, Cassie.
It's quite a lovely day out there today, rather warm. How are things looking across the state?
Yeah, certainly the warm conditions are continuing today. The warmest places in the state at the moment have been up to 30.4 degrees at Nullarbor and 30.2 at Ceduna, 28.5 degrees at both Whyalla and Port Augusta and Oodnadatta and Tarcoola. So, some quite warm temperatures out there, and that's going to be continuing, obviously, for the rest of today and for Friday as well. Just generally a northerly airstream expected for both those days. Could be a bit fresh at times in parts, so that will see those warm temperatures continuing, probably even getting a touch warmer tomorrow. So we'll see plenty of temperatures sort of getting into the inland areas, getting into those sort of low 30s type numbers. Then as we move into Saturday, look, it's going to be dry throughout at first. There will have been a weak trough already moved through, so that'll take some of the edge off some of the temperatures for the more southern parts, back a few degrees, but that's sort of the first stage, I suppose. And then as we move into the later part of the afternoon and particularly evening, we'll start to see some shower activity coming in for the agricultural area, apart from the sort of Riverland and the Northern Eyre Peninsula, where it will be remaining dry for all of Saturday and into the evening as well. But a slight to medium chance of showers coming in later Saturday for the Northern agricultural area, and increasing to a medium to high chance for the Southern agricultural area there as winds, sort of southwesterly winds, come in and produce those showers. The overnight period then from Saturday into Sunday, there's some cold air coming in behind with a sort of cold front coming in there, so there will be colder conditions really extending northwards on Sunday, so we're expecting a high to very high chance of showers and possible small hail for the southern agricultural area, a slight to medium chance of those showers for the northern agricultural area and near the remaining western coasts of the state. We've got some possible thunderstorms also near the southern coasts and over the southeast district, so certainly becoming much colder for Sunday after some quite warm days, particularly for Thursday, Friday. Then into Monday, conditions are going to be easing pretty quickly. There will be some frost patches around early for inland parts, but a new high is going to be coming in from the west there, and that'll see conditions easing off quite quickly. So we're just expecting a slight chance of showers near the southern coasts, the southern Mount Lofty ranges, and perhaps the lower southeast district. They should be mainly during the morning as well, and it'll be dry over the remainder. Then for Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday of next week, there is going to be some cloud around from time to time with a slight chance of showers, but not much in it. Really, mainly dry for that period there. Temperatures will be mild on Tuesday, grading to warm to hot in the west, and then it'll be warmer throughout on Wednesday and even becoming generally hot in the west on Thursday. Now, cumulative rainfall totals, look, we're dry until later on Saturday throughout. After that, until midnight on Monday, the totals are expected to be less than 2 millimetres for the northern agricultural area and near the western coasts, increasing to 2 to 5 millimetres for the southern agricultural area, reaching 5 to 15 millimetres for the southern coasts, the southeast districts, and also for the Mount Lofty ranges to the south of about Clare. So, that's about it. Back to you, Cassie.
Thanks for that, Tom. Tom Bowick there from the Bureau of Meteorology. And in the far west of New South Wales, the upper western will be sunny tomorrow. Overnight we'll get down to 5 to 10 degrees, but the daytime temperatures are going to get up to about 30. The lower western also sunny, pretty similar conditions. Overnight it'll get down to 7 to 10 degrees Celsius, but the daytime temperatures will also reach about 30 degrees. You're listening to The Country Hour. I'm Cassie Huff. It's coming up to 12:30.
You're listening to The Country Hour. For more stories from across the country, go to abc.net.au/rural. On ABC Radio Adelaide, South Australia and Broken Hill, this is Cassie Huff. Cassie Huff.
Hi, I'm so glad you could join me today. Soon I'm going to tell you about a plan to future-proof Australia's food and agriculture industry and how the $150 million being thrown at the CSIRO could do that.
There's a significant opportunity for Australia to producing a wider range of protein and also higher quality protein products for those markets. So I'm talking not only about providing high quality animal protein from our traditional industries like the red meat industry and aquaculture, but also plant protein.
So drought, tech and alternative proteins are some of the things they're looking at. I'll get into that soon. And did COVID inspire you to get back in the garden and perhaps start growing some more vegetables of your own? If so, you were not alone, and the University of Adelaide has done some research that's found you could actually be doing a lot more of it, perhaps even becoming self-sufficient in vegetable production. But is it practical? I'd love to know if you've kept your COVID garden going or perhaps you've opted to go back to the shops. You can text me on 0467 922 891 or phone 1300 222 891. We'll get into that in just a moment. But first we have to find out what's making news with Wendy Glamochak. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Cassie. In the news this hour, embattled South Australian MP Sam DeLuc has confirmed he will be running as an independent at the next state election. His announcement comes after South Australian Greens MP Tammy Franks used parliamentary privilege to level fresh allegations of sexual harassment, racism and homophobia against the former Liberal MP. He was acquitted of assault last month but described as behaving like a drunken pest by the magistrate who made that ruling. Mr DeLuc has denied the latest allegations and challenges Ms Franks, to make the claims outside of Parliament. New South Wales has recorded 1,405 new cases of COVID-19 and 5 more people who had the virus have died. A roadmap out of lockdown's been announced with some regional areas released from lockdown on Saturday. Some stay-at-home orders will be lifted for adults who've received both doses of the vaccine from the Monday after the state reaches its 70% double vaccination target. The Prime Minister has held out the prospect of home quarantine as a way to bring thousands of Australians who are stuck overseas back into the country. And the British government's coming under strong criticism after it was revealed it's removed a key climate change goals from the free trade deal that it's about to sign with Australia to appease the Morrison government. More ABC News at 1 o'clock.
Thanks for that, Wendy. Well, increased exports, drought and some new foods will be at the centre of a $150 million research splurge that's been announced today. The CSIRO research plans to capture an additional $20 billion in value for Australia's farm sector by the year 2030 by targeting 3 key missions. And Michael Robertson from the CSIRO's Agriculture and Food Department explains how the research is designed to work.
The recent East Coast drought, which I think really shook us up, has, I think, been a bit of a watershed moment for research, for government and for the farming sector in thinking, how do we get much more prepared leading into droughts? How do we deal with the stresses when we're in the midst of a drought? And then how do we recover quickly after droughts? We want to get a lot better at doing that in Australia because one thing's for sure, we're going to get more droughts and they're probably going to go for longer in the future. So we just need to get much better at doing this. The mission around drought resilience has the aim of trying to reduce the impacts of drought by 30% over the next decade. How do you even
measure that, though? Is that in terms of the financial impact of drought?
Yeah. I mean, the Australian government, through its Bureau of Agriculture and Resource Economic Sciences, ABARES, collects quite detailed information on farm output and financial performance of the farming sector. And they've shown just recently, for example, about the impact of the recent East Coast drought on those performance measures in New South Wales and compared that with an earlier decade when there wasn't a drought and been able to show the impact. So it is going to be possible to do it, I think, by collecting that sort of information. But we'll also collect social attitudes and perceptions from people in the rural sector about how they're feeling about their resilience to droughts as well, and we'll be using that as a bit of a performance measure as well.
Another key mission area that CSIRO is identifying today is that of agri-food exports, and again another ambitious target, this time to increase the value of the sector by $10 billion by 2030. How do you think you can do that?
Yes, Australia is one of the few countries in the world where we're crucially dependent upon the export market for our agricultural produce. About 70% of what we grow goes overseas. And if one thing we've learnt over the last year, it's been the fragility of those export markets. Being locked out of some of them, having trouble getting entry into new markets, maintaining our hold in existing markets is often really tricky and cannot be taken for granted.
Can you just elaborate a little bit on that? Because given the past 18 months or so that we've had in Australian farming, when we think about trade access, a lot of it comes down to politics, which of course CSIRO will be wanting to keep its nose well clear of. So what do you mean? How can technology find an extra $10 billion for the horticulture and red meat sectors?
So you're right, we can't do much about the politics, but when things like non-tariff trade barriers are put up, often they're couched in terms of technical reasons, like, for example, the product isn't produced in a sustainable way, or the product has pesticide residues, or the product, will carry with it biosecurity risks or food safety risks. And this is where science and technology can help. We can use clever sensing systems, we can use data sharing platforms, we can use digital systems to remove a lot of the red tape around doing a lot of that verification work around those issues, so that importing markets, whether they be importers, retailers or consumers, can get access to that sort of information and be reassured that the products that they're getting from Australia are safe and high quality, and from where they say they're from too.
The other key focus you've identified is new foods or new proteins. Is it possible that there are new foods to be discovered?
Yes, this is an exciting area. I mean, with the world population growing the rate it is, and the burgeoning middle class, particularly in Asia, who want to eat more protein, there's a significant opportunity for Australia to producing a wider range of protein and also higher quality protein products for those markets. So I'm talking not only about providing high quality animal protein from our traditional industries like the red meat industry and aquaculture, but also plant protein for those growing consumer audiences who want to eat more plant-based protein, maybe in preference for eating maybe not quite as much red meat. But the bottom line here, there is a growing protein market on our doorstep for Australia to meet, and more than enough to absorb the exciting growth prospects for both our traditional protein industries and also some of these new protein industries.
How much money do you think the industry could make from new protein sources, again, looking to that 2030 deadline?
Yeah, we think it's probably worth, there's been a number of roadmaps and market analyses done for this, so we think it's probably worth about another $10 billion a year within the coming decade for the Australian farming and food sector. This will be value that will be generated not only by food processors and the like, but also producers of protein on the farm. This growing area of plant protein, for example, we hope will generate a greater demand for our protein crops, so particularly our green legumes and pulses and the like. And there'll also be opportunities for completely new protein industries to be generated. For example, new species of aquaculture being grown, and maybe in different parts of the country as well. You know, it's an amazing statistic for me, Kath, but Australia still imports 70% of the aquaculture it consumes. 70% of the fish we eat comes from overseas. There's a massive opportunity here for us to increase our homegrown industries to meet that domestic demand, and also hopefully generate exports of our own.
Just before we do wrap up, and keeping with the Australian agriculture sector, the Minister recently had a quite a crack at CSIRO over what he suggested was the promotion of grain or plant-based meat over, his words, genuine meat. How much of these missions and this focus announced today is in response to that?
The protein mission has a very big emphasis on both supporting our traditional protein industries, so red meat and aquaculture, but also exploring this very exciting challenge of meeting a new market need around plant protein. So it's certainly not trying to promote one over the other. We think there's room for both. And by the way, we think there's opportunities for farmers in both, more importantly. And, we're just reading the market signals there. A significant proportion of consumers out there are seeking alternative sources of protein in their diet, and we're doing the R&D to try and help produce those products.
CSIRO's Dr. Michael Robertson speaking to Kath Sullivan, and you can read more on this at abc.net.au/rural. Now, I was among those of you who were COVID inspired to get back into the garden and plant some veggies. I'm not sure how successfully I did it, but I did get a few tomatoes off my tomato bush. And if you put in a COVID garden, you were not alone. And the University of Adelaide has done some research that's found you could actually do a lot more of it. In fact, the study has found that 93% of residential blocks in Adelaide could actually be self-sufficient in vegetable production. Professor of Soil Ecology Tim Cavagnara believes that there's a lot of scope to enhance urban agriculture in Adelaide. He joins me now. Good afternoon.
Right, good afternoon.
So you've been looking at just how much land it would take for people in urban areas to be self-sufficient. How did you go about this?
So this has been a project that we've been working on for a number of years, and this work's been done by a PhD student, Isabel Hume. And what we've been doing is using airborne imagery. So imagine the kind of images that you see in Google Earth. So using high-resolution imagery to look at the amount of land that's potentially available to urban agriculture in Adelaide. And so we've focused on the amount of space that's currently dedicated to lawns in backyards. So we're able to use some spectral imagery and some remote sensing to work out how much land is presently in backyard lawns. And then we took some published yield data from urban farmers in Adelaide, backyard gardens. And what we found was that on a high yield scenario with 21.3 square metres, you could produce 5 serves of vegetables for the average Adelaide household of 2.5 people.
So you can have your lawn and eat as well.
That's the line that we go with. You can have your lawn and eat as well. And, we're not being anti-lawn or anything like that. The point that we're trying to make here is that backyard food production can be a really valuable part of a backyard mix. So I'm not imagining a future where every square centimetre of backyard is in vegetable production, but you might have a reasonable proportion in food production. You might have some areas for amenity. You might have lawn. You might have a patio or a barbecue area. But I guess the argument that we're trying to make is that with a relatively modest amount of backyard space, you can produce quite a substantial amount of food as well.
You've been working on this for some time now, but what does some of the recent modelling that you've done show?
So this study, the figures I've quoted here, we published these data late last year, and that was looking in 40,000 houses around Adelaide, and they were centred around Aldinga and Gawler and the Burnside area. We've more recently used imagery from the entire Adelaide area, so we're now looking at the whole metropolitan Adelaide area. We're not getting up into the hills, but on the flats. And what we're finding there is we're getting similar values for the amount of land, although they are decreasing slightly as we move to some of the inner city suburbs where the blocks might be smaller, or we're seeing some infill. But what we're starting to do now is we started off with the question that if you don't have enough lawn to produce enough food, then this isn't a plausible activity. We found that we think there's enough land to produce the food. So the next question then comes about is there enough water? And so what we've been doing more recently is using similar imagery sort of analysis techniques to look at the amount of stormwater that you could capture on the average Adelaide roof. So we know how big the roof spaces are. And what that's basically telling us is that even in a dry year, we can capture enough water to supply or to irrigate the crops. The question then comes about how large a tank do you need to store that rain, for example, that might come late in spring through to the end of summer.
You also looked at nutrients and sort of the required, agronomic elements that come into it as well. When you're adding that into it, do you think it is a viable proposition for a lot of people, perhaps with smaller areas that you're looking at now, or with the more inner city areas that you're looking at now?
Yeah, so we did some earlier work as well looking at soil health in urban agricultural systems, and that was some work again done by another PhD student, Matt Solomon. There were some really interesting questions there around looking at the amount of nutrients that people were putting in, and what we found was that there was a lot of enthusiasm for tending to one's vegetable patch, and so nutrient levels are actually quite high in those soils. And so we think there's probably a piece of work to be done to really try and help educate people in how to optimally farm those systems and to add the right amounts of nutrients and not add too much. So I think from that perspective, there's good opportunities. In terms of space, it becomes quite interesting. If you have two neighbours, one side of the fence might be shaded and the other side of the fence might be in full sun. And so you start to get to some interesting situations where I might be able to grow tomatoes and you might be able to grow something on your side of the fence that's not tomatoes. And then you start to get trading and sharing of that produce. And so that has a whole host of benefits from a sort of a social community engagement perspective, but it also avoids the problem that, there's only so many tomatoes that you can eat or so many zucchinis that you can eat. So it's around that sharing. I guess the point I'd also make is that, with a relatively modest amount of space, even if you're, in a building and you've got a balcony, you can grow some of your own food in pots on those balconies as well. So not everyone is going to have the time or the resources to produce all their own food, but if you start to look at this more at a community level, then I think you can really start to make a significant dent in achieving self-sufficiency.
I guess the next step is making sure we get rid of these pesky fruit flies, and more people might be keen to get their veggie crops up and running again.
Absolutely. Look, and that's a really important part of this, and we are trying to start some new projects in this space around educating people in how you deal with the challenges of growing food. It's not just the nutrients, it's the pests and the diseases and ensuring that the food's safe. If you're using, for example, you might have manure from a chicken coop or something like that. You need to make sure that that's processed in a manner to ensure that that food is safe to eat as well. You don't want to contaminate it with things. So there's a whole bunch of really interesting education questions around managing pests and diseases and safety, and also optimising your yields.
Well, it sounds like there's a lot of scope for urban farming in Adelaide. I look forward to hearing more of your research. Thanks so much for your time today.
Great. Thank you for the opportunity.
Professor of Soil Ecology, Tim Cavagnaro, speaking there. Has this inspired you to get out and perhaps put in some veggies? Maybe you already did during COVID, or perhaps maybe you're still mulling it over, or maybe you just prefer to go to the shops. Let me know, 0467 922 891 or phone 1300 222 891. It's 13 minutes to 1.
You're listening to Cassie Huff on ABC Radio South Australia and Broken Hill.
To maybe slightly bigger farms than a backyard in Adelaide, to the Riverland. And reaching 100 years is always an impressive milestone. And for people, it's usually marked with a letter from the Queen. But how do you celebrate a centenary of a fruit orchard? Monash grower Frank Hewitt says this year marks a centenary since his soldier settler father, Jack, put in the first plantings there.
I took them over from my father, who was an original World War I settler, and when Dad passed away, I came back from Western Australia. I'd already worked on the block. I left school at 14 and I was 21 when I went over the West, and then I came back and got married, and been here ever since, yeah.
What does it mean to your family to mark about 100 years of this orchard?
Really, you just take it in your stride. It's no different to anyone else. That's your living and that's where you follow it. I believe we've been very fortunate. We never really suffered with fires or floods or anything of that nature. Dad stayed with the figs when other people got out of them, and he interplanted them with his vines because they took a long time to come into bearing. It wasn't until he passed away that I was able to get rid of the vines, because vines and figs don't mix. They go up through them and create a lot of work. Initially, all our fruit was dried fruit, and that died out, and then we went to glacé fruit with a company called Turravale, and Gawler Park, who was down in Angaston. Dried fruit used to go to Bellis product in Adelaide.
What have been some of the biggest changes that you've been part of?
One of the biggest changes would be when the water was put underground rather than in channels, and gone to irrigation, made irrigation so much easier. Like, it was always a terrible job to have to change the water every 2 hours to 3 hours during the watering period, and your water came when they allocated it, instead now we're able to ring up and do it on call. So that is probably the biggest single change. That and mechanical harvesting and mechanical pruning, and they were probably the big changes that enabled the wine industry to get going in this area.
What do you think your father would say about the orchard today?
I don't think he'd recognise it, to be honest. It's changed so much. The original Monash area there was olive trees planted along the edge of the trees, and there's only 2 left of the original ones, and they're heritage listed down the bottom of our blog.
What are some of your hopes for maybe the next 100 years?
I think because of the size of the old blocks and that sort of thing, we will probably take over from Virginia or something like that when transport gets easier, and we'll go to produce it with a higher value. That's the only way I can see this area surviving.
Frank's daughter, Sue Heward, has been running her own dried fruit business since 2017, using produce from the orchard. She says she's been flat out packing orders, with shop regional campaigns and COVID-19 lockdowns boosting online sales.
So yeah, we're working out of a little room in our house right now, but hopefully not too far away we'll have our first manufacturing shed. That's our aim next.
I was going to say, imagine this room and these processes weren't here when the orchard was started 100 years ago, but you're already envisioning the next step.
Sure. Back then it was probably, as we went into premium maximum production, it probably was all about a commodity. Now it's much more about how we still sell wholesale to South Australian companies like Maggie Beer and Berenberg and Douglasdale in terms of what Mum and Dad produce. But then we're also looking at how we vertically integrate within our own family orchard, and that's where the online and the value adding comes into place. So for us, it's not so much about trying to buy another block and get bigger and bigger, but how we use our land more efficiently and how we're much more sustainable. Obviously, it might be raining right now, but we know there's water's a limited resource. So how can we get better at looking after the land that we've got and use everything? So pretty much every quince that we grow, we use in some way, whether it's wholesale or whether it's sun-dried, or then, as I was saying, we have a sticky quince syrup as well, which essentially was a waste product. It was the cooking liquid that we used when we cooked the quince. But if you reduce it down, it's divine. So we've got another premium product instead of calling it waste. We don't have any waste products. We try and use everything.
What does it mean to your family to mark about 100 years of this orchard?
Well, I think it's pretty special that you can have a centenary. You know, not everyone gets the opportunity to be in their town at 100 years. Looking forward to the next 100 years. That was the owner of Singing Magpie Produce, Sue Heward, speaking with Elijah Burlage. And finally today, you might have been hearing people ask you, are you okay? It's Are You Okay Day today. And one person who's very aware of that is Brendan Cullen, a grazier from Carrs Station in Western New South Wales. He's been an advocate for those battling mental health issues in the bush and has spoken at a number of events for Lifeline around the country. He's an ambassador and supporter for the Royal Flying Doctor Service and Lifeline. And he spoke with Andrew Schmidt about the ongoing battle for people in parts of the far west who are still facing issues with drought.
There's plenty of places in and around Broken Hill and the greater district that haven't had rain. So, yeah, we do have those conversations quite regularly. But people are cash poor, Andrew. I mean, it takes a long time to recover from a drought. I mean, the commodity prices are really good, but there are plenty of people out there that aren't fully stocked. To become profitable or be in a good space in regards to business-wise, you know, you need to be back up to 90% stocking rates to be back in the game, and there's plenty of places out there that aren't in that space at the moment. So, yeah, it's a real issue.
We often hear that on the back of a drought like the one we've been through, it can take 4 or 5 years, even to get back to that situation, that you lost that 4 or 5 years previously. Are they some of the conversations you're having?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you just need to reassure these people if they're hanging in there trying to make a quid, and you just need to reassure them that to stay in the game and give them some tools that they're able to work with to be able to stay in the game and give them some confidence more than anything. Otherwise, you just end up on this merry-go-round where it becomes Groundhog Day, and that's no good for anyone.
Once you've had these conversations with people and things are put in place and the wheel turns a little bit, and as you said, commodity prices are all right and they restock and they do get a few spots around, are you seeing some positive signs, or are you still seeing that people are doing it tough?
Look, there's a bit of both. It just depends on where you live, really. Whether you've had the rain and you've had the opportunity to get back in the game. But if you haven't, that's a real issue, because we spend a lot of time out in the bush looking over the fence at what the neighbour's doing. It causes a lot of anxiety there if someone's had 30 mil of rain and you've had 2. Or this time of year, say for example, we've had about 4 inches this year at Cars. There'll be people out there that have only had 2 inches, and there's others out there that have had 10. And we know the difference between 2 and 10 inches of rain and what it can do for your business. So the important thing is to try and stay the course the best you can. There's ways and means of doing that, but it can be a struggle, especially if it goes on for a long period of time, especially 4 years.
What are some of the pointers you give?
Oh, look, basically when I have these discussions with people, you sort of know when they're in a very ordinary situation, and you try and make these people step back and have a look from the outside, because generally what happens is they don't see what how they're operating, because they're just busy getting up in the morning and flogging themselves to bits. So the real thing is to make them recognise the situation they're in. And then from that point, you can sort of work from that point. And secondly, like I said earlier, you can link them up to services that put them in a really good headspace to be able to make those decisions. Because if you lose the capacity to make decisions, you generally end up in that groundhog experience.
If you've got people in that situation, Brendan, then you put on top of that what we're facing now with the pandemic and the lockdown, and we know that there's always that outlet there, wasn't there, to go and socialise with the neighbours or forward to this gymkhana or whatever it might be. A lot of that's now gone. Has that compacted some of these problems?
It has. Absolutely it has. I mean, human nature. I mean, we're social beasts, aren't we? Whether you live in the bush or, live in a town, we all love company. And we all have the opportunity to make that decision whether we want to be around someone or we don't. But in this situation, we don't get that opportunity to make that decision. It's forced upon us. So that makes it really difficult. What I have seen is escalation in alcohol consumption. There's always been a heavy drinking culture in the bush, certainly increased over the last 2 or 3 years, certainly with a number of people I've had conversations with. And they're self-medicating. It's not their fault. It can escalate into a situation where where it's not good for them. So that's certainly happening at the moment.
By your own admission, you went down a similar path a couple of years ago and you turned that around. Do you use that as an example?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm a walking example of that, mate. But, I've put myself into a pretty good headspace where I can deal with that, give myself a few tools to be able to handle the situation. And when those tools that I use are tools that if something creeps back into my life that I'm familiar with that I don't like, I act upon it. And it's made a massive difference to the way I operate.
Brendan Cullen from Cars Station. And much of the state, South Australia and the far west of New South Wales, is looking for rain as the weather warms up. So hopefully it does come soon for those guys. And as always, Lifeline is there to talk if you need on 13 11 14 as well. I do hope you are okay. That's about it from me today. But Sonia Feldhoff will keep things going. Good afternoon.
Hello, Cassie. Well, if you are someone who hates roadworks, you might be pricking up your ears with Fraser Ellis's suggestion that we should be increasing the fines for those roadworks that stay in place when they're
When no
There's
one's
nothing
there.
happening when no
So
one's there.
frustrating.
We know there are laws against it, but should we be increasing the penalties? We'll be taking a look at that. And how you going, Cassie? What did you think about your scone recipe that you were allocated today? What did you get?
I'm delighted. I got date scones. I've never cooked them before.
Rigged. Good country girl making date
And it's
scones.
a really simple recipe, which is the key to a good scone. So I'm elated with my selection.
Simple recipe, lots of room to muck it up. Is all I'm saying, Cassie. Not that I'm trying to get into your head. Judging, scones need to be on the table by 2:00 tomorrow. I know what you'll be doing. I got fruit choc scones, chocolate scones.
Oh, well, tune in tomorrow to hear the results. It's coming up to 1:00.
Discover more great ABC podcasts, live radio and exclusives on the ABC Listen app.